Okay, so welcome to another wonderful program at Merowitz Center. I'm Laura Bryant, and thank you for joining us today. Today's program is part of our ongoing presidential legacy series. Last year, we featured Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, Harry Truman, and in fact, next week we have a follow-up program with Lincoln, so don't miss that. Presidential Legacies has turned out to be one of our more popular series, and we're even possibly looking into a program with Jeff on Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady. This afternoon, we're featuring FDR, the longest serving president in American history. As you probably know, this is a three-part program, and today is part 3, our final segment. It's a pleasure to welcome back Jeff Urbin, education specialist at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. The previous 2 segments focusing on the National Archives and the Great Depression were very compelling and just something that I think people will be talking about for a long time. Today's session will focus on World War II. So Jeff, we're happy to see you again today, and you're definitely one of our most popular headliners. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. As I look out there, I see you guys are looking like old friends now, and I have to tell you that today's presentation, as I'm giving this in my head, I'm hearing Elvis singing, "And now the end is near. I turn and face the final program." All right, so that's going on in the back of my head. And I apologize to everyone who will now have that song in their head for the rest of their day. But hey, that's what we do here. So we're bringing it on home here with good old FDR. And, we've tried to hit some of the highlights over these 3 sessions. Obviously, there's always more to learn about President Roosevelt, especially, the fact that he was president for 12 years. But I think the big things that, we've talked about are, who they were and how we, kind of came about and what this presidential library stuff means, what the New Deal was all about and the Great Depression. And then, today we're going to talk a little bit about FDR's leadership and such in World War II. And, a little less than a year ago, World War II became pretty, I don't want to say popular, but in the consciousness again for a lot of folks, because the last time we had somebody pouring over a border in Europe was World War II. And so there was a lot of this, is this the beginning of World War III with what was going on in Ukraine and such? So that's one of the fun things. And I think I said this last time that, and I think with Linda and I had this little discussion that, history kind of, it echoes, you hear about these things over and over again. It never comes back exactly the same, but it does come back, in tone and tenor and such. And FDR was very, very cognitive of this when it came to the Second World War. So I want to first set the foundation and the context for World War II, and then talk a little bit about Roosevelt's leadership through that by talking about sort of an arc of victory that he kind of pulled the nation and the world along with that. And then I think also last week, Linda had mentioned, that, when you hear about these things, it can be pretty depressing. It can really kind of, be a buzzkill and bring you down and such. But the important thing is that we live through it. The important thing is that we learn from it. And I'm going to leave you guys with words that were never actually spoken by FDR, but that were written by FDR. And that's going to leave you, I think, on a positive upbeat. So let's talk about World War II, get some perspective. Now, many of you probably know a lot about World War II, but I work with like 35,000 students in person each year. And World War II might as well have been, the Peloponnesian Wars to a 5th grader. They, unless it's Lord of the Rings, they don't know. So let's get some perspectives. First of all, World War II was huge. I mean, super huge. It was a world war for sure. It was fought on most of the continents. It was a global war. The sun never set on World War II. Once World War II started, it was being fought someplace in the world every single day for the next 6 years. And it was also a total war. It wasn't like today where you tune in, and you sort of say, oh, how's it going? What got attacked today? Are we winning? Are they winning? This was a total war. This was a war that involved men, obviously, the men that went off to fight, women who worked here in the factories at home. Some women also actually went off to fight as well. Children who were involved with scrap drives and paper drives and, wrapping bandages and those sorts of things. It involved old folks, right, who maybe were too old to serve, but could go down and, work with the Red Cross or sit on the roof with binoculars and spot planes, those sorts of things. And it involved not just the military, but civilians, industry, you name it. The war lasted for 6 years. It was 2,194 days long. Now, if you remember this Ukraine thing, right, when it first started, we're talking, oh, it's day 56, it's day, 97. We've stopped that now because it's gotten to the point now where we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary. But, these were 2,194 dark, dark days, not just in American history, but in world history. Started on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. You'd be surprised the number of people who think World War II started on December 7th, 1941. That's when it started for us, started for Europe in September of 39. And ironically enough, it ended on September 2nd, officially 1945, with the Japanese surrender on the deck of the Missouri. And that ceremony lasted just 18 minutes. So, all that battle, all that fighting, 6 years of trauma, turmoil, death, destruction, and it's over in 18 minutes. Roughly 60 million people were killed in the 6 years of World War II. So that's 10 million a year. Look at that with some of the COVID numbers that are going around, and you get a sense of the complexity of that. And when you multiply that 60 million who were killed by the families, the mothers, the fathers, the brothers, the sisters, the aunts, the uncles, you get a much larger number and a much larger sense of the human cost. And there are people alive today that still feel that from that time. 16 million Americans served, 416,000 were killed. So that would be, if you just do some quick math, 69,333 per year, 5,777 per month, 189 per day, 8 per hour. So if this was World War II, by the time we finish this presentation, 8 American servicemen or women would have been killed. The cost of the war, $4 billion, billion with a B. Now, we talk billions a lot these days, but you didn't talk billions a lot back in 1939, 1940. And the Manhattan Project, the project that built the atomic bomb, that alone was a $2 billion project. The impacts, the aftermaths are still being felt today. Certainly the, all echoed all throughout the Cold War. And the thing that people forget is that World War II was fought with a huge undertone of racial and ethnic prejudice. This was not just a war for a lust of land. This was not just a war for a lust of money or of power. It was a war that was fought to eliminate people that some other group didn't think should exist. Right, and that's pretty, that's pretty grisly. The Nazis were out to destroy anyone who didn't fit their definition of who was a superior person or part of the master race. And it's interesting to note that if you pull up pictures of the top Nazis, not a single one of them would really pass the muster for what the Aryan was supposed to look like. So they couldn't even meet their own, foolish and inhumane standards. And of course, the greatest hatred was directed at the Jews of Europe. So it was fought with no guarantee we were going to win. In fact, we look back now 80 years later and we think, oh, of course we win. The good guys always win. Oh, we won the war. And that was never a foregone conclusion. When the United States entered the war on December 7th, 1941, we were ranked anywhere from between 14th and 17th behind Portugal in military strength. We went to war fighting the Second World War with World War I weapons and uniforms and equipment and such. After entering the war, we entered the war with half of our Pacific Fleet destroyed. The Japanese took care of that for us. That was the whole idea of the Pearl Harbor attack. And then after entering the war, we racked up a significant number of losses and defeats well into 1943. So, you see the Day of Infamy speech and, FDR is all getting everybody riled up and, woo, grab your guns and off we go. And it was another 2 years before we really started to turn the tide. In August of 1942, the Nazis were all over Europe. What they didn't actually occupy, they surrounded and thereby controlled. And their Italian allies were in the north of Africa, and their Japanese allies were encircling the Pacific Rim along that way. So this is big doings, right? And so when we're talking about FDR and his leadership in World War II, we're not talking about obviously a pillow fight, all right? We're not even talking about a regional war. We're not even talking about a hemispheric war. We're talking about a global war. Now, we benefited, thank goodness, by some of Hitler's foolish mistakes. Hitler envisioned himself this grand, military genius and all this. And of course, he wasn't. And so he opened a second front with the USSR after having a non-aggression pact with them, saying, okay, we won't attack you, you don't attack us. And he did that to buy himself some time. And then when he thought it was advantageous, he attacked the Soviet Union, pushed all the way through almost to Moscow. Right. This is one of the reasons why, Russia is so worried about, what's going on its western border. And what this did was it forced Hitler to fight in two directions. Right. So he put himself in basically a vice with the Russians pushing from one side, and after D-Day, the Allies pushing from the other. Hitler also, when he went south from Europe into the north of Africa, instead of turning right and going west towards the Middle East, which was rich in precious resources like oil, for some reason he turned left and headed over toward Morocco, which had very little to offer in terms of material and such for the war. In fact, President Roosevelt goes and he visits the King of Saudi Arabia during the war in order to, pay homage and get access to the oil, which was so critically needed to win the war. And Hitler depended too heavily on his other European ally, which was the Italians. He moved into the north of Africa, turned left, headed toward Morocco, and the Italians weren't able to hold the north of Africa. And in fact, it was their weakness and our ability to take advantage of that taught us the many lessons that we needed to know as we first invaded Morocco, and then Sicily, and then some of the other islands there, then mainland Italy. We were racking up important information and important skills and important abilities that came in to be critical for the amphibious invasion on D-Day. So probably, without doubt, World War II was the most deadly, most destructive, most costly war in the history of mankind. And it was only a generation, there's the generation that fought that war is still with us. And probably the greatest lesson that we learned from World War II was that we couldn't survive a World War III. And this was something that FDR specifically and especially understood. There were about 16 million people killed in the First World War, 60 million people killed 20 years later in the Second World War, and Roosevelt knew that if there was a third World War, hundreds of millions of people would likely die if the war went atomic, and he knew we were working on an atomic bomb at that time. So this is the context that I want to provide Roosevelt's leadership in. And I'm sorry if you're a World War II buff and you knew all of that, but I just wanted to get a sense of, when this guy, comes to power first in the Great Depression, the country is flat on its back. When the Second World War begins, the world is in really, really serious shape. But I believe that FDR was exactly the right man at the right time and at the right place. And I'll build my argument. You can agree or disagree with me, but I'm going to build my argument over the course of this presentation. So the first thing we have to wonder about is the cool sort of thing of history that Franklin Roosevelt, the good guy, and Adolf Hitler, the bad guy, came to power within 6 weeks of each other, and they died within 6 weeks of each other. All right, so they occupied the world stage at precisely the same time. It was almost as if fate, was sort of balancing out good and evil, at that time. And just as Roosevelt was getting ready to leave power in the end of his second term, 1939, 1940, Hitler had just solidified his power and then was beginning to take over the world, or try to take over the world. And so that's what led FDR to run for the third term. He didn't think there should be, breaking in a new president, just as Hitler had solidified his power. And Roosevelt had FDR's number early on. And Roosevelt, as a child, had traveled back and forth to Europe over 15 times growing up on trips with his parents. He knew how to speak some German. He knew how to read German, and he had gotten a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. FDR had a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf in the original German, which he read. Years later, he got a copy of Mein Kampf in a English version. And he wrote on the inside cover of his copy, I'll read it to you and then I'll show you. It says, "This translation is so expurgated as to give a wholly false view by what Hitler really is and says. The German original would tell and make a much different story." So here is a copy of the inside flyleaf, sorry, I'll get my face out of there, of FDR's copy of Mein Kampf. And you can see it's Franklin Roosevelt, the White House, 1933. He's saying, hey, you know what? I've read the original, baby. This thing's been cleaned up for American consumption. And this Hitler guy is a bad idea. This guy is a bad dude. And in fact, he reached out to Hitler when FDR and he first came to power. He said, hey, let's find out how we can work together. And Hitler basically laughed in his face and said, no, we're not gonna, I'm not gonna deal with you. I've got my own plans. And so it was clear to FDR that this guy was not somebody that we could work with. So by 1939, Hitler has solidified his power. And as is the case with American presidential politics and power, first because of the two-term limit and now because of the 22nd Amendment, the minute the president is reelected to a second term, his power begins to diminish because his time in office is diminishing. And he doesn't have that ability to sort of, hold over, he can say, hey, Cindy, you better work with me because, I might run for a second term. He can say that in the first term. So now Cindy has to calculate, okay, how much do I want to stand up to this guy? He could be around for another 3 years in his first term, or he could be around another 8 years if he gets a second term. But the minute the president is elected to a second term, the clock starts ticking and you can begin to plan waiting out the president. And so by 1939, that's what was happening. Roosevelt saw this, he recognized it, and he said, no, I need to be president again. And I need to be president again for two reasons. Number one, I'm worried about my New Deal programs, right? The 44 programs of the New Deal are starting to be challenged in the courts. And if there's not a strong Democrat to follow me in office, then these things will be taken apart and my legacy will be dismantled. But more importantly, somebody's got to stand up to this Hitler, and it can't be a presidential newbie. By 1939, Franklin Roosevelt had 7 long years of governmental administrative experience. And this guy did the job, right? He created over 44 programs of the New Deal. It wasn't like he dabbled a little of this and dabbled a little out of that. He knew how to get stuff done. He had many allies in Congress, people he could pick up the phone and say, hey, remember that time I swung through there and campaigned for you? Or, hey, remember that dam that we built in your district or your state? Here's what I need you to do for me. So he had a lot of allies in Congress. And he also had folks all over the country who owed him favors, not just politicians, but people in industry, people in, in the arts, people in the media, all these kinds of folks. He had built these relationships over the course of time, and he was able to capitalize on those. He also had the trust and the faith of the American people. And this is a bizarre concept, right? Because today, you take any poll, and half the people don't believe, that the government knows what it's doing. Half the people don't believe anything the government says. I mean, there's still people who don't believe we walked on the moon, right? And I remember being woken up at 6 years old, and my mom said, "You got to watch this." And it was like the middle of the night, and I'm watching this moon thing. And if they didn't walk on the moon, I'm calling my mom, and there's going to be trouble, okay? Because I needed that rest. And I was cranky the whole rest of the day, right? So, and then my mother walked around the house saying, "Oh, they could send a man to the moon, but they can't make a kid not be cranky." Well, you woke me up. But anyway, that's another story. So he had the trust and the faith of the American people. And he had this in large measure because he had always been pretty straight with the people. His fireside chats, he sat down and he said, "Listen, just like I'm talking to you, here's what we're going to talk about today. Here's what I'm going to do about the problem, and here's what I want you to do about it." And this gave people a sense of being a partner with the president. He also had relationships with world leaders from all over the world, and he knew how government, media, politics worked. He knew how to turn all those wheels and make all those things happen. Any new guy or gal to the presidency would have had to learn all those things. He had those skills already. But wait, there's more. He also had collected stamps from the time he was a little teeny baby. His mother gave him her stamp collection, and so he grew up collecting stamps. And at the time of his death, he had over 1 million stamps in his stamp collection, 150 bound volume of stamps. And Roosevelt collected stamps not for their monetary value, but for their historical interest value. So he believed that if a country thought enough of a person, a place, a building, to put it on a stamp, then it had to have some kind of cultural meaning to that country. So he would get a stamp and there'd be somebody on there, and then he would go and Google whoever it was. Maybe not Google, but he would go look up whoever it was, and he would learn about, oh wow, that's the famous revolutionary guy. Or this building, oh, that's the famous Parliament building, or all those sorts of things. So he knew when it came time for World War II, he knew the geography of the world better than most people because he had studied stamps from every corner of the earth. And he knew the cultures and the histories of those people because he had been studying those things since he was 8 years old. That is a really important skill to have when you are fighting a world war. So that the generals, they thought, oh, we're going to have to come in and tell them where Anzio is. Oh, he knew where Anzio was, and he knew about the palace that was there, and he knew all these sorts of things. So he knew what he was talking about. He also had been, and this is the second great dress rehearsal that President Roosevelt had for the presidency. He had been the governor of New York State during the first 4 years of the Great Depression, trying out many of those programs that become the New Deal here in New York State first. And he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. So he knew how to get ships and supplies and men and materials and planes and all that sort of stuff across an ocean to a country that was fighting on a different continent. And that was a really great skill to have when you suddenly find yourself in a world war. Now, another one of those advantages that we took, that Hitler, being a fool, Hitler, we weren't in the war with Europe, right? Once Japan attacked us, we were in war with Japan. But Roosevelt really wanted to be fighting Hitler because he saw him going all the way back to the Mein Kampf book of what a pain in the neck and what a jerk and what a diabolical guy this was. That's really the war he wanted to fight. But the Japanese attacked us, so now we were in the Pacific War. Well, Adolf Hitler ends up declaring war on the United States on December 11th, right? 4 days later. And so now Roosevelt has what he wants. We're in the war with Japan, and we're in the war with Europe. So when you take all of his administrative experience and you take all of these natural skills that he developed just by happenstantial living, and you take the fact that he was put on the earth at exactly the same time that Hitler was put on the earth, I think we have exactly the right guy at the right time with the right skills. Now, I'm not saying that everything he did was perfect. I'm not saying that everything he did worked, but I'm saying on the whole, if I'm the job guy, right? And, Roosevelt comes in with that resume and somebody else comes in with a much thinner resume, I'm going with the guy with the experience personally. So we've got the context. We got why FDR seems to be the guy for the job. Now let's talk about Roosevelt's wartime goals. And President Roosevelt had 3 wartime goals. The first World War II wartime goal was to stay the hell out of it, right? He did not want to get in the Second World War. He had been assistant secretary during the First World War. He gives a famous speech, I hate war. He did hate war. He saw how expensive it was, not in money, but in the lives of people. He saw every soldier that was killed as somebody that had a potential to contribute something to the planet, and it was snuffed out in that war. He hated war. He did not want to be in a Second World War. And what's more, the American public didn't want to be in a Second World War. We were very upset about the First World War. Started off all patriotic. Oh, over there. Ooh, let's go get those guys. And then we got over there, and here's the barbed wire, and here's the trenches, and here's the poison gas, and here's the airplanes for the first time, dropping bombs and shooting machine guns down. It was no fun, and we did not want to get on the mailing list for the Second World War. So number 1 goal of the Second World War, stay out of it. The second goal for the Second World War was, if we get in it, win it decisively, right? Win it decisively. There can be none of this sort of mamby-pamby, end of World War I type of stuff. World War I, the Germans surrendered, but it was kind of like, have you ever played Scrabble with somebody? And, you start off and you're playing pretty good, and then they're like a couple points ahead of you, and then you're a couple points ahead of them, and then they're a couple points ahead of you, right? And it's pretty clear that you're not going to win eventually, right? You just keep getting within 10 points of each other. And after a while, it's just no fun, right? And so what you say to your friend is, look, this game's been going on for like an hour and 20 minutes, we're pretty evenly matched. We're not going to win. I'm not going to win. You're not going to win. Let's just call off. Okay. Let's go do something else. Right. And the other guy says, okay, we'll do that. And then like 20 minutes later, they start in with the, boy, I really kicked your butt that Scrabble game a little while ago, didn't I? What do you mean you kicked my butt in the Scrabble game? We both agreed to stop fighting. Oh, no, I had the upper hand. I was going to beat you. No problem. If we'd gone 5 more minutes, I would have had you in the... Right. And so this is exactly what happened in World War II, because there was no decisive victor. Germany felt like it didn't really lose the war. It surrendered to end the war. And then Britain and France were all dancing around. Woo, we won. Woo. Right. And this built up resentment in the German people. No, you didn't win. We had an armistice that called the whole thing off. That's what happened. So just like if your friend keeps rubbing your nose in that game that you both agreed to call off, and you would say how mad you get, that's what was going on in Europe. So Roosevelt understood that the seeds of the Second World War were sown at the end of the First World War. So if we get in this war, we're going to win it decisively. We are going to destroy the Nazis. We are going to destroy the Axis. There's going to be unconditional surrender. There's not going to be any deals. There's not going to be any sweetheart, arrangements and all that sort of stuff. We win, you lose, and then we dictate the terms of peace to you. That was a Roosevelt goal. And that was a little bit controversial as the war went on, because people are thinking, well, this war is going on and on and on here now for 6 years. Maybe somebody would surrender if they felt they could negotiate a peace. And Roosevelt said, no, that's what happened in the First World War. We're going to win this thing decisively, and we're going to create a new world order. And that is what brings us to goal number 3. Goal number 1, stay out of it. Goal number 2, if we get in it, win it decisively. Goal number 3, create a mechanism that prevents a third world war. We cannot have a third world war. This was one of the major goals of President Roosevelt once we were in. Stay out of it, win it decisively, create a mechanism that prevents a third world war. And he does this with a long arc of speeches and actions over many, many years. And I want to lay those out for you there as well. So everybody with me so far? We got the context, we got the resume, we got the goals. Now we're going to implement that plan. So the first thing is he gives a famous speech in October of 1937 in Chicago, and he calls it the quarantine speech. And what this does is he basically gets out there and he says, hey, listen, you know what? There's trouble spots in the world. And if there's trouble spots in the world, the people around those trouble spots need to take care of that. If you have somebody in your neighborhood, Hitler, I'm looking at you, right, who's being a pain in the neck and causing problems, it's up to the countries around that to do something about it. Now, sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. But what he's trying to say is, we don't want to get involved with this, right? I want to stay out of it. That's his number one goal. So anybody that's got trouble in your area, do something about it. Quarantine whoever's giving you a problem and snuff out that little fire right where it is. Then in November of 1938, right, Hitler has rearmed. He's building up his army again, right? He's got all these guys, these thugs, these Nazis in uniform, and they're all marching around and they're getting ready to, to beat somebody up. And Roosevelt sees this, and in November of 1938, he calls for the production of 10,000 combat aircraft per year. Now, this is an important point, right? Because remember last week we talked about the New Deal programs? Those were programs that built things like roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, libraries, that sort of stuff. Roosevelt could very easily have gotten the economy moving again in 1933 by building tanks and planes and bombs and that sort of stuff. He didn't do that. That's what Hitler did. That's what Mussolini did. That's what Franco did in Spain. That's what the Japanese did in Japan during the global economic crisis. But Roosevelt said, we're going to build domestic stuff. Now he's departing from this a little bit as he sees the trouble on the horizon out there. And he calls in 1938 for 10,000 combat aircraft per year. In September of 1939, when Hitler pours over the border into Poland and starts the Second World War, and by the way, we talked a little bit about archives. The initial documents about World War II in our collection are labeled under Polish crisis. So if you were to come and say, oh, I want to see how World War II started, it's going to be, I don't really know what you're talking about. Oh, the Polish crisis? Because we didn't know it was World War II yet, right? It was just Hitler, but you know what I'm saying? It was Hitler pouring over the border into Poland. So Hitler does this, and President Roosevelt declares the United States officially neutral. Okay, officially neutral. And he says to people, I understand if you're not neutral in your hearts and your actions, but the United States is officially neutral. Now, part of this is two things. Number one, he's still trying to stay out of it. And number two, there were a lot of neutrality acts and neutrality laws that were passed after the First World War that tied our hands so that we wouldn't get into a Second World War, right? Congress, after the First World War, passed all kinds of, you can't sell stuff to belligerent nations, you can't be involved in this, you can't do that. We stayed out of the League of Nations because we didn't want to get tangled into any of that stuff. So there were a lot of neutrality laws that were passed. And I say that in a broad sense, but they were all kinds of trade agreements and migration agreements and that sort of stuff. So officially, we're neutral. So that's September of 39. By next spring, May of 1940, FDR calls for an increase from 10,000 aircraft each year to 50,000 aircraft per year. So what he's beginning to do here, boys and girls, is he's beginning to prepare for the war. He doesn't want to be caught too off balance. He doesn't want to be caught, too unready. But at the same time, he doesn't want to get involved in the war, right? So it's kind of like, May rolls around and you get ready for, swimsuit season, right? So you say, oh, it's May. Oh, I don't want to have all these extra pounds when I get out there at the beach this summer. I think I'll skip the salad, right? So you want to make sure that, you're starting to get ready. But then when you get to the beach, you don't really want to go in the water. That's what FDR wanted. He wanted to be prepared. Let's have 50,000 planes per year, but let's still try to stay out of this. In September of 1940, right? So we're talking September 1940. It's an election year, right? So it's September, October, November is the election. He institutes the first ever peacetime draft in American history. So he says, we're not at war, but I don't like what I'm seeing over there. So we got these 10,000 planes. Now we got these 50,000 planes we're building every year. And I'm going to call up some boys and we're going to begin to build our army. First time ever peacetime draft 2 months before a national election, right? That's leadership. Okay. I mean, that's like, hey, this is what has to be done. If it costs me the election, at least we'll have this thing going. So there you go. Then in December of 1940, so 4 months later, he declares America the arsenal of democracy. Now, again, this is still keeping with his, we're not in the war yet, right? This is still keeping with his plan of stay out of the war. Goal number one, stay out of the war. But prepare for the war. Let's get those planes. Let's get those soldiers. And then he declares us to be the arsenal of democracy. So what he's basically saying out there is, hey, any of you nations that are getting beat up by anybody, you know, like the Nazis, if you need stuff, we got it, right? But there's a problem with this. Now, here's what's interesting. Let me go with interesting first, and then we'll talk about the problem. So eventually, within a year and a half of the attack at Pearl Harbor, the United States is providing 80% of the material the Allies are using to fight the war, right? 80% we are producing. Why are we able to do that? Because we invested in infrastructure during the Great Depression, roads, buildings, bridges, ports, airports, you know, education, that sort of stuff. So it's often said in World War II that the English they provided the tenacity, right? They're sitting 30 miles off the coast of Europe, but they're clinging to their toes, you know, and they go through the Blitz and all that sort of stuff, right? So they've got the tenacity, right? We're not taking any crap, Hitler. You know, we're gonna beat you. And then the Soviets, the Soviet Union, they provided the manpower. About 20 million people were killed. 20 million Soviet people were killed during the Second World War, right? So again, this feeds into the paranoia. I'm not justifying what's going on in Ukraine. I'm simply saying that if you understand some of the historical underpinnings, you can see where some of this stuff is coming from. So the British provided the tenacity, the Soviets provided the manpower, and the United States provided the manufacturing. Those planes, those tanks, those ships, those tents, those bullets, you know, all that stuff, or not all of it, 80% of it, 8 out of every 10 of those, or 8 out of every 100, 8 out of every 10 of those, 80% was something that we were providing and we were building. Now, here's the problem. We are the arsenal of democracy, but those neutrality acts I mentioned a minute ago prevent us from selling stuff to countries that are fighting. We can't do it. We can make it, but we can't sell it, right? So FDR, clever guy that he is, comes up with this idea. And the idea is a thing called lend-lease. Right? Lend-lease. The law says, what does the law say? The law says you can't sell it to those guys. Oh, it doesn't say we can't lend it or lease it, right? This is the old thing of like when my father used to say, I don't want to see you going out that front door and hanging out with those hoodlum friends of yours. If I see you go out that door, there's going to be trouble. Okay, Dad. So I'd go to my room and I'd climb down the drain pipe, right? I'd go out the window, climb down the drain pipe, go out, have fun with my friends. And then when my dad yelled at me, he said, I told you I didn't want to see you go out that front door. Did you see me go out the front door? Ah, you didn't, did you? I went out the window, right? And that's how Roosevelt got around the neutrality acts, by lending and leasing. We weren't selling this stuff. We were trading it. You know, it was cash and carry kinds of things. You know, we'll make you a deal. And he was able to get around it that way. And a lot is made out of, lend-lease that went to, to Europe, but a lot of it went to the Soviets as well. Okay, so it wasn't just, lend-leasing stuff to our European allies, but the Soviets got a lot of that stuff there as well. Now, right, stick with me. We're covering a lot of history here, but that's what you get when you have Franklin Roosevelt, right? If this was the presentation on Gerald Ford, we'd be playing cards right now, okay? Because we would have gotten through all the material. Nothing against President Ford. He was only president 2 years, right? Okay, so here's the deal. In that, he gives a famous speech on January 6th, 1941. It's a State of the Union address. And in that State of the Union address, he does two things. Number one is he lays out the plan and the argument for Lend-Lease. And he does it by selling it to people by saying, if your neighbor's home is on fire, it's in your best interest to lend them your garden hose and allow them to put out the fire there before it threatens your house, right? And that's what the idea of Lend-Lease was, because people were nervous, like, hey, you built all this stuff, now you're giving it away. You know, that's not good. What if we need it? And his argument was, let's let them use it and get this guy taken care of. Again, what's my goal? Stay out of the war. So first thing he does in this State of the Union address is lay out Lend-Lease. The second thing he does is he gives what I think, and this is just me, right? But what I think is one of the most important political speeches in certainly American history and possibly world history. And in that second half of the speech, he lays out what he calls the 4 freedoms, right? And it comes on, here's a copy of it. It comes on page 17 of the speech, and you can see the president was constantly making adjustments and changes and things as he went. So he lays out this thing and he says, you know what? I see a world based upon 4 fundamental freedoms. In future times, in order to make peace, and secure the world, it's got to be based on 4 fundamental freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second, freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is the freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings, which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear, which, when translated into world terms, means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. See it for yourself. And I know you probably can't read that, but there it is, and you can always Google it. Okay, so Jeff, why is that so important, you say? Well, because what this is a alternative narrative to Adolf Hitler, and it is the foundation for, number one, what we fight for in the war, and number two, what we try to create after the war. It is the 4 freedoms. And you're probably all familiar, right? Norman Rockwell goes out there and he paints freedom of speech. And this is important because what this is it's a guy talking at a town meeting, right? And he's saying his piece and nobody's yelling at him. Nobody's knocking him down. Nobody's shouting at him. He's got freedom of speech everywhere in the world. And then freedom of religion. So here are people who are, some are clearly praying, some are simply contemplating, right? They're appreciating, their humanity, they're appreciating their creator in their own way everywhere in the world. And then freedom from fear, okay? And this is a mom and a dad, and they're tucking in their kids into bed at night. If you focus in, you probably can't read that, but there's on the front page of the paper, they're talking about war and bombings. The mom and dad know about this. The kids don't. They are sleeping with visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads. Well, maybe not at this point, but they were a couple of months ago. And so this is the idea of freedom from fear, and then freedom from want. Okay, freedom from want. And this is a particularly interesting one. This one was actually pretty controversial when it came out. It shows a traditional American Thanksgiving dinner, and much of the rest of the world at this point was starving. So this was seen with a little bit of American arrogance. Now, when Rockwell painted this, though, he made a very interesting choice. He de-emphasized, freedom from want being stuff, because what he's done is he's used a lot of white. There's a white window with white curtains. There's some kind of painting over here, a picture with a large white frame. Grandma is wearing a white apron. The tablecloth is white. The things that they're drinking in their glasses is water, which shows through to show the clear white. So the things that are colored in this are not stuff, it's people, right? Freedom from want. It's all about our people. It's all about us taking care of each other. Okay. Now, why is this important? Because what this does is it lays out an alternative narrative to the narrative that Adolf Hitler was offering the world at that time. Roosevelt says, stop right there. Here's what we got to do. You follow that guy, you're going to get death, murder, destruction, genocide, hatred. Or you can follow my idea, a world based upon 4 fundamental freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And he says in the speech, if you ever had to go to war, and remember, we're not in the war yet, right? This is January 1941. We don't get in until December. If we ever had to go to war, these are the things you fight for. You don't fight for land. You don't fight for money. You fight for 4 basic fundamental freedoms. And that's exactly what Roosevelt lays out with this. Now, in August of 1941, he goes to visit with Winston Churchill, and they draw up what's called the Atlantic Charter. And it's basically a deal between us and England to say, we're going to fight Hitler. We're officially neutral, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to stand up against this guy, and we're going to fight for things like freedom of the seas, free trade, no territorial gain. And we're basically cementing this partnership that we have with England. Now, also in 1939, President Roosevelt invited the King and Queen of England to the United States, and they had what was called a hot dog picnic. It was called hot dog diplomacy, because he wanted to introduce the American people to the King and Queen as just regular guys, right? These are the people I got to give this material to, or lend lease this material to, right? And look, they love hot dogs just like us. Isn't that nice? Isn't that cute? Okay, so you guys are with me on this? And he's selling this diplomacy, right? Stay out of the war, right? Let's let England do it, but there you go. And then, of course, on December 7th, 1941, comes the Day of Infamy, which, if you ever look at that speech, was originally a date that will live in world history. Do I have it with me here? I probably don't, because that's the kind of guy that I am. All right, take my word for it. You've heard the speech, all right? A date that will live in infamy. So now we're in it. Right? We're in it. And the closing line to that speech is, no matter how long it takes us, we will win on to absolute victory. Here comes goal number 2. We're going to win this puppy, and we're going to win it decisively, right? We're going to win it decisively. So then what happens is, in January, Roosevelt says, okay, we're going to have a, this is like now January, right? So we're talking 3 weeks later, January of 42, Roosevelt says, hey, we're going to have a conference. I'm having a conference in Washington. So any of you nations that want to be united against Hitler, come to the White House and we'll talk about how we're going to do this. Any of you nations that want to be united. And this is the beginning of, hey, that has kind of a ring to it. United Nations, that's kind of cool. So here's what he does. He takes this piece of paper, and here's a sketch. These are the 26 countries that were at that conference. And what's interesting about this is it says, so it's the countries that are listed. What are these pencil marks? Well, it says here, this is the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And underneath there are things like Canada, South Africa, right? Who else is up there? India, Australia, New Zealand. So this lists England, and then underneath it, set aside over here, are the colonies that England has. If this was 1775, our name would have been on there. FDR sees this and he says, no, we're not fighting for the British Empire. We're fighting for the 4 freedoms. Remember? Okay, 4 freedoms, right? And he takes his pencil and he takes them and he lists them where they ought to be in alphabetical order in the world level. Now, when Churchill sees this, he almost poops a scone, okay? He is so upset by this, right? He's like, oh my God, what do you mean? You're going to dismantle the English empire? Yeah, Winston, I'm going to do that because I'm not spilling American blood for your empire, pal. We already fought a war to get out from under you, and we're not going to help you subjugate other folks. So Winston Churchill has to kind of take this because he needs our help, right? So this is the beginning of the United Nations. Now, if you look really closely, I don't know, let's see here. If you look really closely and squint and clap your hands and pretend that you believe in Peter Pan and Tinkerbell, you can see the USA, UK, USSR, and China. This was FDR's plan for what he called the 4 policemen. So when we finish this war, there's going to be 4 policemen, us, England, China, and the USSR, and we're going to prevent these guys like Hitler from ever happening again. So he talks about that, at this point with that at this conference. So then it goes on, and what happens is he goes to Tehran, right? They have these wartime conferences. The first is Casablanca, 1943. Maybe you've seen the film. And what's interesting about that is that's where FDR says unconditional surrender. And he gets the other allies, the Soviets and the British, to agree with that. Why? Because now we're in the war. We're going to win it decisively. We're not making any deals. We're not making any deals. Then he gets to Tehran in 1943, and he's doodling during a meeting, right? I think, I don't know, Churchill was probably, oh, never before have so many have so little, right? And he's bored, right? So he says, all right, what is this United Nations going to look like? And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the sketch for the United Nations. It has an executive, has the 40 United Nations, an executive committee, and the 4 policemen that I just showed you a minute ago. Down below, what is the United Nations goal going to be? An ILO, International Labor Organization. We're going to give people jobs. Why? Because they create money, right, through paychecks, but they give you a purpose. If you got something to do every day, you're not likely to go out and become a revolutionary, right? Oh, I'd like to join the revolution, but I got to get down to work, okay? And then also a Food and Agriculture Committee and a World Health Organization. What are these essentially, ladies and gentlemen? They are the 4 freedoms. So Roosevelt is going to build this United Nations based upon the 4 freedom. If we give people jobs, that's freedom from want, right? They're going to have money. If we give them jobs, they're going to have a freedom from fear because they're going to know what they're supposed to do every day. If we have a 4 policemen operation, they've got freedom from fear because they're not going to be attacked. The 4 policemen will protect them, and they can get on with the other things that they need to get on to with their lives. Then comes Yalta. And the Yalta conference is really important because it's at that conference that FDR says, Stalin, you in or you not in, right? You got to be in on this because you're going to be one of the 4 policemen, and we need your help and we need your support to be part of this new United Nations. Once we defeat Hitler, the new United Nations will keep peace in the world, and you guys need to be a player. We want you at the table. And Stalin says, yeah, or whatever. I don't know. I don't speak Russian. So you know what he did? He did this. He nodded. Okay, that's good. That's good. So he nods and he says, "Yeah, sign me up, baby. I'm in." And so this is where we get the Soviets bought into the United Nations. Then on April, in the end of April, April 24th, there was supposed to be the very first conference of the United Nations in San Francisco, USA. And what happened was Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945, 2 weeks before the conference. At the conference, he was going to tighten up the screws on Stalin a little bit and, really get him to try to behave. Stalin sees FDR is dead, and he says, "Ooh, this is my chance to back out of some of this stuff. I was a little bit too wined and dined by FDR." And he begins to go back on he takes advantage of the fact that Harry Truman doesn't know what was going on at these conferences, and he begins to backpedal a little bit out of his way and a little bit back on this. This is why people blame FDR for giving away Eastern Europe at at Yalta. He didn't do that. He said to the Soviets, look, you guys have got to be in here. You got to be part of this. And the Soviets were already in Eastern Europe. Remember that vice that Hitler was in? The Soviets were coming from the east. We were moving toward the west. We were trying to get to Berlin, and the armies were there. We had two ways to get the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. Fight them out, right? And we had just gone through 5 years of war. We weren't in any mood to do that. Or negotiate them out. And that's what FDR was trying to do, right? If Hitler couldn't defeat the Soviets, and he was right there, us after 4 years aren't going to be able to do it. We got two ways to get them out: fight them out or negotiate them out. And that's what he was looking to do. So there you have it. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but we won. Woohoo! And it's a good thing. Otherwise, we would all be talking German right now. Okay. And the United Nations came about. It's still in existence today. And so far, it has prevented the Third World War. We have not had a Third World War since the Second World War. So Roosevelt's idea is working. Now, sometimes people say, yeah, but the United Nations is pretty ineffective. It doesn't really work. It does all kinds of great work, but it doesn't do great work that gets on the front page of the newspaper. It does all sorts of things with food and medicine and education and those sorts of things that is all behind the scenes and doesn't make the headlines. And you say, well, yeah, but what about this preventing wars and stuff? Well, it hasn't prevented wars, but if you don't think that they're effective in that, ask two people. Ask a North Korean and a South Korean, okay? Because it was the United Nations that fought to get the North Koreans out of South Korea. Which one would you rather live in today? North Korea or South Korea? Well, you've got the United Nations to thank that there is a South Korea. So I went way on. We got 1 minute, so you're going to have to speed talk. If there's any auctioneers out there in the audience, please channel your questions to them. They can ask me, and we'll get the questions. But I'm willing and able to stay a few extra minutes because I was such a windbag. So if you want me to, and that's the problem. I'm from New York, right? I talk like 780 words a minute with gusts up to 920. Okay, so you guys, let me know what you think. Any questions, comments, snide remarks, and then we'll go from there.
I think you've got a lot of questions, Jeff.
Great.
So, I think is Marilyn, is that you? You got a
Yeah,
question?
yes. Thank you. And I don't want to put a damper on anything, I swear. And
Okay.
he was a wonderful president, passed a lot of bills, but I think you know what I'm going to say.
Mhm.
I have the book FDR and the Jews, which is an old book, and it's a wonderful book. And it's sort of hard for me to forget that he turned away 900 passengers on the ship of the St. Louis and denied them entry into the United States. And consequently, it was a death sentence for most of them. And he could have had the authority to allow that ship to enter the United States. And I mean, that's just, I realized that he appointed this one to the Supreme Court, and I realized he did this and that for the Jews, but that sort of sticks in my mind, especially after reading that book.
Yeah. Well,
And I don't mean to put a damper on your speech by
no.
any means.
You raise an excellent point, and it's a point that's raised by many people. And I do not want to sound like an apologist. And I myself have spent 23 years studying this, going back and forth, back and forth. Did he do enough? Could he have done more? Did he do enough? Could he have done more? And I go back and forth. He did a lot. And in many ways, he did what he could politically. The Republicans had passed these immigration quotas and restrictions, and they were being administered through the State Department. And there was a guy by the name of Breckinridge Long who was anti-Semitic, and he was holding to these quotas very, very tightly. That's why the ship was not allowed in. Now you could say, well, why didn't President Roosevelt override that? Well, because he's fighting a two-front world war. Okay, so his plate is very full. And he didn't have the political support to do that. Keep in mind that just as there's so much anti-Semitism today, there was even more then. And Roosevelt, being the politician, always had to balance this reality of what he wanted to do and what he was able to do given the political considerations. There was not the political will for a lot of support for the Jews in the country at that time. And had he created the War Refugee Board in 1941, as opposed to 1943, a lot more Jews would have gotten out, because by the time he opened the War Refugee Board in 1943, the gates had closed in Europe, and it was really, really hard for folks to get out. But I have a curriculum guide. If you go to our website, and you look under for teachers curriculum guide, I have a Holocaust curriculum guide, and you will see there are 36 documents there that document things that FDR did in order to try to rescue and save the Jews of Europe. And in fact, one of the biggest things FDR was afraid of was a guy by the name of Lindbergh. All right, Charles Lindbergh was a big national hero at the time, and Roosevelt was afraid he was going to run for president. And Charles Lindbergh, a couple interesting things about him. He won an award from the German Luftwaffe. Right, he was kind of soft on what the Nazi, the Nazi party and such. Henry Ford, the same thing, right? And Henry Ford is the only American mentioned in Mein Kampf. And if you go to the Smithsonian and you look at the Spirit of St. Louis and you look really closely on the end of the propeller, there's a swastika, right? Not to support the Nazis, but because it was originally, before Hitler turned it into a thing of hate, it was a symbol of luck. So that's why Roosevelt wasn't able to do more. He did whatever he could do, or what he thought he could do politically.
I understand. Thank you.
Thank you. But that's a perfect, wonderful point.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, let me just build on that too, because then there was also the controversy of, well, why didn't he bomb the rail lines, right? Well, they looked at that. They looked at bombing the rail lines to the death camps, and the argument there was that you're bombing two rails that are running 800 miles behind enemy lines that you're going to try to knock out with gravity bombs, right? Even today, with lasers and satellites and smart bombs and all these things, you still get collateral damage. You still miss when you do these kinds of things. And the argument was, well, the Nazis will rebuild the rails because they've gotten very good at that. So then the argument was, well, why don't we bomb the camps? And we thought, well, that's going to play right into Goebbels, because Goebbels is going to say he's the Nazi propaganda guy. Look, even your own people are bombing you. That's how little they care. Well, why didn't they bomb the fences? You've seen the pictures. These people were in no condition to run anywhere. So Roosevelt's argument was, we win the war decisively. We get rid of these guys once and for all. Win the war, we end the death camps, we end the Nazis, and we go on from there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great point.
Does anyone else have any questions for Jeff?
Yes, a simple question. First of all, you may have geared this for fifth graders, but it was perfect for me. You mentioned the cost. Did you say $4 billion and $2 billion for the Manhattan Project?
Yep.
So the Manhattan Project was half of what we spent?
About half of what we spent in the war, we spent on the Manhattan Project. That was one of the first private-public partnerships, because the government put up the money, and a lot of universities and think tanks and that sort of stuff did a lot of the work. And what they did was they decompartmentalized it so that nobody knew what they were doing. And that was for security purposes and such, so that you wouldn't be able to put it all together. You say, well, what do? I don't know. I just grind these things down and I put them in a box. I don't know what it's, but I can't tell anybody about it. What do you do? I don't know. I just take calculations and I do that. I don't know. And then it was all put together for what was called the Manhattan Project. But the actual name of the atomic bomb, until it got its two proper names, Fat Man and Little Boy, the name for the atomic bomb was actually tube alloy. That was the code name. How do I know that? Because I got the memo right here. Tube alloys. And this was a memo that was created between the United States and England. Winston Churchill was in Hyde Park, and they talked, and then they wrote down these 3 points. So the first one says, we're going to build this bomb together, the United States and England. The second one says, we're going to use this thing to end the war, the second paragraph. And then the third paragraph, I think, is very interesting, because it's really the beginning of the Cold War down here. And I will read it to you. It says, inquiries should be made regarding the activities of Professor Bohr and steps taken to ensure that he is responsible for no leakage of information, particularly to the Russians. Now, Stalin had spies. He knew we were building an atomic bomb, but we didn't tell him we were building an atomic bomb. So he was kind of like, in grammar school or middle school where two of your friends are going to go ice skating and they don't invite you, but they're going ice skating, right? So you go over and you try to crack the ice on the pond they're going to be on. That'll learn them. No, I'm just kidding. But that was why Stalin was so nutty about this stuff as well.
Well, just that makes a follow-up question. Were some of these documents classified at the time and now they're not classified?
Yes. If you had known what tube alloy was back in 1942, you would have been in jail. Here's an interesting thing, D-Day, right? So they're getting ready to plan D-Day. And this guy, one of the guys that's planning this thing is doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. And every day, and he's doing this thing and he starts seeing things like sword is one of the words, Juno, right? Gold, Overlord, right? All these names that were code names for D-Day. So they thought, is this guy trying to give like information out through the paper? So they hauled him in and they were like, what do you know about what's going on? And he's like, I don't know anything about what's going on, because he didn't. It was just happenstantial. So yeah, a lot of this stuff was classified and then it has been declassified over time. Anybody else?
Hey, Jeff, I have a question.
Okay.
How long was the Lend-Lease program in effect before the war began?
Before the war began?
Well, I mean, before we entered the war.
Before we got involved. It started in January of 41, and then we were in the war by December of 41. So however many months that is. What is it?
Like 11 months. Okay,
11
that's
months.
what I was wondering. Okay.
I'm a history major, not a math major. Okay, sorry. But I can
Any-
count on my hands, right? Like I can count to 5, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Wait a minute, what?
Does anyone else have any other questions? Because this has been a wonderful 3-part series. It's just, you do a great job of connecting the dots for us and helping us look at history with fresh eyes.
Well, thank you. There's a lot to cover. There's a lot of more depth and detail I'd like to get into with some of these topics, but all we can do is sort of wet your whistle. Now, I want to leave with this line. So Franklin Roosevelt was supposed to give a speech at the Jefferson Day party or Jefferson Day remembrance. And this was a day, they used to have this Jefferson Day and it was for Democrats and they would use it as a big fundraising, because Jefferson was like the first Democratic president, of being a Democrat, so they say. And so Roosevelt was working on a speech to give at that dinner, and he never gave the speech. He died before he had a chance to do it. But the last thing he ever wrote that he intended to read to the American public was the last sentence of that speech says, the only limit of our tomorrow is our doubts of today. Let us go forward with a strong and active faith. That's how he was going to end that speech. And so I want to, lay that out there for those of you that, are thinking, this history stuff kind of gets me down. Well, it gets you down, but you got to take FDR's word for it. The only limits of what we can do tomorrow is what we're doubting today. We pull together, we work together, we find out what we need, we put our differences aside and find out that there's more that joins us than keeps us separate. And we can listen to those echoes of history and get out of the way for when they come back. Go forth with a strong and active faith. That ain't me telling you that. That's Franklin Roosevelt telling you that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. We appreciate it, and we hope to see you at the library sometime.
Yeah, come on in. Buy me a coffee, and I'll let you go over to the ticket counter and buy a ticket. So that'll be good. And then also next Thursday at this time, I'm gonna be. I was telling I was saying I'm gonna be in the park throwing rocks at the pigeons.
We'll miss you, but you know what? Maybe we can come up with a program talking about Eleanor.
Hey, there you go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay,
Excellent.
we'll do it. Okay.
Happy trails, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Trails to you.
Bye-bye.
Until we meet again.